Yeah, the Curse of Bobby Layne now. For people to understand this story, you have to recognize how different the NFL was back in the 40s and 50s, because that's when this curse starts. In the late 40s and 50s, the top NFL teams were the Bears, the Eagles, the Browns, the Rams, and the Lions. This is shocking to modern NFL fans. It's not that the Bears and the Browns and the Lions have never been good. It's that you have to be 70 years old to remember it. The Bears slightly less so. The Detroit Lions will tell their story began life in 1930 as the Portsmouth Spartans in Portsmouth, Ohio. They appeared in the 1931 NFL championship game, actually, losing to the Packers in just their second season. They moved to Detroit then in time for the 1934 season. They were renamed the Lions, who don't count the Portsmouth seasons in the team records.
Really? Bears still count the Decatur Staleys for the record.
The Lions, after moving in 1934, won their first NFL title in 1935. 2 years in Detroit, one title. They got 15 years of solid but not championship level play. And then in 1950, the Lions acquired quarterback Bobby Layne from the now defunct New York Bulldogs. Bobby Layne was a former two-way player and All-American quarterback for the Texas Longhorns. Besides being the quarterback, he was a defensive back, he was the place kicker, and he was a 4-year starter on the baseball team that never lost a conference game with Layne in the lineup. He wasn't a football scholarship, he was a baseball scholarship. Just one of those unbelievable athletes. So he was drafted in 1948 by the Pittsburgh Steelers, who at the time, believe it or not, had no winning tradition. None.
It's hard to believe that.
I know we associate the Steelers with winning, especially in the Super Bowl era, but in the 40s and 50s, they were a laughing stock. They'll come into this morality play later, too. The Steelers immediately traded Layne to the powerhouse Chicago Bears, where Layne sat buried on the depth chart behind Sid Luckman for his entire rookie season. That offseason, he was traded again. So it's entering his second year. He's already been traded twice to the short-lived New York Bulldogs. The Bulldogs were so ineptly run that Layne nearly gave up football. The Lions, who needed quarterback help at the time, offered a pittance for Bobby Layne, and the Bulldogs gave him change back. Once he got to Detroit, Bobby Layne was the starter, but he immediately feuded with the head coach, Bo McMillin, over who got to call the plays. Surprisingly, it was McMillin who got his contract bought out. The Lions hired Raymond Buddy Parker as the new head coach. He immediately turned the play calling duties over to Bobby Layne, and all the Lions did after that was win. A lot.
Nice.
The 50s were a golden age for Lions football. Detroit claimed 3 straight division titles from 1952 to 54. And in 52 and 53, they carried the momentum on to win 2 NFL championships, both times beating the Cleveland Browns. It was Layne who's credited with inventing the 2-minute offense in the second of those title wins, where Layne drove Detroit the length of the field in the final 2 minutes to earn the game-winning score in a 17-16 classic. One reason he was so great in the fourth quarter might have been because that was about when he'd sober up from the night before.
Likes to party. Can't blame a man for that. A young man.
Oh, yeah.
Dennis Rodman would be proud.
He was one of the hardest partiers in Detroit sports history, and that's saying something. He was known around town as a notorious partier, as evidenced by his less than athletic belly. Didn't matter. No quarterback ever had better intangibles. He was one of the first 2 first ballot Pro Football Hall of Famers ever. He was the first athlete ever to be pictured alone on the cover of Time magazine. And when the Lions released a set of cards commemorating their first 60 years in 1994, Bobby Layne was the only quarterback.
Hey, you mentioned his beer gut. Smoke and Jay Cutler would agree quarterbacks don't need to be in shape because if you remember when he signed with the Dolphins out of retirement for 10 million, they asked, "What have you been doing to stay in football shape?" And he said, "I'm a quarterback. I don't need to be."
Jeez.
Fins up.
Yeah, the Lions get to 1957. Coach Buddy Parker had just been hired away by the Steelers. Remember them? But the team, the Lions, was still looking like a contender after a bad year in 56. It was late in the 57 regular season that the worst happened. Bobby Layne got tackled by two defensive linemen, broke his leg, missed the rest of the year. Now, this was still a Detroit Lions team that was absolutely stacked. There were 7 future Hall of Famers on the 57 Lions without Bobby Layne.
Ooh.
Detroit still rolled to an NFL title, beating, again, the Cleveland Browns. This time it was a 59-14 shellacking, which, by the way, I should note that Cleveland still won like 4 or 5 titles in this span themselves.
They were just always in the championship game that year, that decade. It was like
Yeah.
LeBron going to 8 straight championship games. He didn't win all of them. He's on a losing end, but he won a lot of them too.
So this is Detroit's third NFL title in 6 years and their fourth NFL title overall in a league that's less than 30 years into their modern version. You would think that Detroit would count their blessings and get Bobby Layne back under center for as long as he wanted to be there. That's not what happened. In 1958, the new management, remember they had just hired a new coach in 57, decided that they were tired of the partying ways and the broken leg. At that time, they thought that was something that an athlete did on their way to the athlete morgue. So they went and they brought in a veteran quarterback named Tobin Rote. And the Lions insisted on platooning both of them at quarterback. They would literally alternate quarters.
This is weird because I would have figured they would have just walked away, said, "Hey, we won the championship without you, and you broke your leg." But instead, they kept him and then just basically demoted him to the a office manager, like they did in The Office with Michael Scott and Jim at one
Yeah.
point.
It's important to point out that this was a different era of the NFL. This was pre-free agency. This was no salary cap. Your team pretty much had you unless they decided to trade you.
Okay.
And that's eventually what happened. The Lions and some of the local media thought Layne was done. He was not having success rotating quarters with
It's hard to
another
get room.
quarterback. I wonder why.
It's never worked out. We've tried it since. So yeah.
So the team decided to cut bait and go with the kid. The middle of the season, the coach called Bobby Layne and told him, report to the Pittsburgh Steelers. You've just been traded. Click.
Ouch. At least he went back to his old coach.
Well, exactly. It was that abrupt for the man that had been the heart and soul of the Detroit Lions for 8 years. All the Lions got in return was quarterback Earl Morrall. If you've never heard of him, that's the point. And 2 future draft picks. Layne was extremely upset. He thought it was just a brutal way to thank him for everything he did for the Lions. Basically, 2.5 titles. Layne made 2 remarks.
Wait, the Lions got rid of a good player before time being in an unceremonious way that offended them and the fan base? That sounds like something that would be repeated over time, possibly.
Never quite like this. Layne made 2 remarks at the time that stick in the minds. This is where the curse comes from. The first comment was, with that management, the Lions won't win for 50 years. Remember that comment because I'm coming back to it later. The second one was, I'd like to win a championship for the Steelers and for myself to shove down Detroit's throat.
I like this guy. Fire.
There was comparable outrage by the fans after hearing that Layne was traded also. The Lions fans couldn't believe it. Now, to fully understand the next part, you need to realize, again, Pittsburgh Steelers up until the late 50s were the laughingstock of the NFL. So when he was traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers, he was traded to Siberia as far as football is concerned.
This almost reminds me of the change in the guards. Isn't that like kind of what the Curse of the Bambino was like, where the Boston won like 5 World Series, they got rid of them, went to the Yankees, and then they won 700?
Yeah, it is amazing how many times the Lions are going to play Kingmaker coming up.
Ooh, I like where this is going. Go on.
The Steelers were founded in 1933. They were briefly called the Pittsburgh Pirates. By 1958, 25 years later, the franchise had one playoff appearance, 0 division titles, and 0 playoff wins.
Sounds like the Lions now.
Former Lions coach Buddy Parker started with the Steelers in 57. We talked about him. Layne arrived in the middle of 58. Bobby Layne started the remaining 10 games of the 1958 season, as well as the next 4 years before he retired a Pittsburgh Steeler. All 5 of those years were non-losing seasons, which at that time for Pittsburgh was saying something.
Mm-hmm.
After Layne's retirement, the Steelers bottomed out again in the mid-60s before they hired Chuck Noll in 1969 and drafted Mean Joe Green that same year, and this sets up the powerhouse Steelers teams of the 70s. Yeah, Bobby Layne never brought the Steelers an NFL title directly, but he did bring star quality. He raised expectations. He arguably taught the franchise how to win. So make no mistake, this is one of the biggest trades in Steelers history and absolutely a highlight of the franchise. It was the prehistoric example of them getting it together and winning.
They've had so many great players since him. It's hard to forget what he meant to the franchise at the time, where at the time he retired, he probably was by far the greatest Steeler of all time until that point, which changing the culture really mattered because now he's probably not even top 30.
Well, I mean, he is a first ballot Hall of Famer. And if you go see his stuff in Canton, the Lions logo is up there right next to the Steelers logo.
That's fair.
For Detroit, though, the effects of the curse Bobby Layne uttered were immediate and severe. Unofficially, William Baker became the first victim of the curse in 1960 when Baker was found dead on the sidewalk after 27 years as the Lions mascot. Nobody is safe.
I was not expecting death to be involved in this curse. Poor mascot. Wow.
Oh, it will not be the last one. As for on the field, though, Tobin Rote fell on his face as Layne's replacement almost immediately. So did Earl Morrall, the main return in the trade once his chance came. For decades, the Lions were unable to find even a halfway decent quarterback. In the 20th century, the more notable names include Jeff Garcia, Joey Harrington, Charlie Batch, Scott Mitchell, Gary Danielson, yes, the announcer Gary Danielson, Eric Hipple, Gus Frerotte, Dave Krieg, Rodney Peete, Ty Detmer, Chuck Long, Jeff Comlow, more on him, unfortunately, in a moment, Eric Kramer, and dozens more.
I have some comments like Jeff Garcia on that list because Jeff Garcia was a Pro Bowl quarterback for the Niners and the Eagles, but in between he quarterbacked the Lions and the Browns, and he was not good in those stands. Oh my God.
No, not even close. These were the better quarterbacks out of the list that Detroit had.
Yeah. I remember there being some synergy with the Bears and the Lions when I was looking at history. Like Layne and Luckman were kind of same era. And then you had to wait decades. And then you had Eric Kramer in 96 and Scott Mitchell, where they weren't good, but they were good statistically. And then you had the Matt Stafford, Jay Cutler era, where maybe they weren't that great. Stafford might be a Hall of Famer now. He's won a Super Bowl, but they probably have all the records just because they played in the modern era and were above average.
Some of them are pretty decent quarterbacks. The Lions got to the playoffs with Charlie Batch without Barry Sanders. Joey Harrington was not a great quarterback, but he was also blamed for everything from sacks to drop passes to winter blizzards, and he wasn't alone.
Real quick, I want to tie this back to last episode's What If with Ryan Leaf and Peyton Manning. Charlie Batch, same draft class, was the number one rookie quarterback of those three before Peyton Manning took off. Only as a rookie. And we're splitting hairs.
Quite simply, the Lions haven't had a top flight quarterback since the days of Bobby Layne until at least Matt Stafford. The quarterback body count, though, is nothing compared to the graveyard of coaches that Detroit has become. Since letting Buddy Parker go to the Steelers, Detroit has had 20 head coaches, including interim coaches. Darrell Bevell, who was 1-4 in relief of Matt Patricia. Dick Duran, 1-4 after Steve Mariucci was shown the door. And Gary Moeller, who went 4-3 after Bobby Ross was shoved out. Only 3 of those 20 coaches left with winning records. The most important was former NFL MVP and a career Lions linebacker, Joe Schmidt, who coached from 67 to 72. The second was the aforementioned Gary Moeller, who went 4-3 and was promised to stay. But then the Lions hired Matt Millen to general manager, and the first thing he did was fire Gary Moeller.
And do you say there's only three of them, and one of them was 4-3?
Yep,
I can bet who the third one is. Was it Caldwell?
you got it.
Go
Third
on.
and most recent, he led the Lions to their two most recent playoff berths, despite the roster deteriorating rapidly in 2015 after general manager Martin Mayhew was fired and replaced by Tom Lewan. It was Lewan that blamed Caldwell, and then he went on to hire his buddy Matt Patricia.
I remember Caldwell 4 years. I think he had a winning record in three of them, and his worst record was 7-9, and that wasn't even the year they got rid of him. I looked into this history of the Lions a few years ago, like the last 20 years, and his record stands out so high above all the other Lions head coaches in modern time that, in my opinion, it is a travesty that he has not been hired as an NFL head coach since, especially because he took the Colts to the Super Bowl one year.
On that point, two statistics put the Lions' coaching ineptitude in perspective. One, out of all the Lions head coaches since Buddy Parker in 1957, the only one ever to be a head coach in the NFL ever again after being the Lions head coach was Dick Duran, and he was the 2005 interim guy.
Oh, man, he was terrible in Chicago.
Two, the last time a Lions assistant coach was directly hired as an NFL team's head coach with no stops in between was 1972. That was Joe Schmidt's staff.
The one with the winning record. One of
Yeah.
the three.
The Lions' job is the ultimate NFL resume blight.
Hey, Matt Patricia landed on his feet that from going from defensive coordinator to head coach to offensive play caller or something in New England, making sure they had the worst offense in their season. Never mind.
One thing that all of this had in common is ownership. And that's the first thing that people who don't believe in curses point to. William Clay Ford, youngest son of Edsel Ford, grandchild of Henry Ford, was briefly involved in Ford Automotive in the design branch and kind of shown the door. He bought his first stake in the Lions in 1961 when this team was still, if not one of the best in the NFL, still a solid franchise. Before Christmas 1962, then, the Ford Rotunda burned to the ground. Most people today have never heard of the Ford Rotunda, but it was built for the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago, then relocated in 34 to be near the Ford Motor Company's headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan. At the time, it was the fifth most popular tourist attraction in the United States, ahead of Yellowstone, the Washington Monument, and the Statue of Liberty.
Wow.
Gone.
Whew.
So this curse has followed the Fords personally. William Clay Ford, after he bought his stake, quickly took advantage of bad blood between the two main owners at the time to buy out everybody else and gained sole ownership of the team for $4.5 million in 1963 dollars. Became official November 22nd, 1963, and was announced that day, which made it the second biggest news story in Detroit on that day.
What was the biggest?
JFK's assassination.
Can we cut me asking that?
If you can see Brian's face right now.
Wow.
In William Clay Ford Sr.'s 50 years of Lions sole ownership, note the number of years. Management like that, the Lions won't win for 50 years. Detroit barely won over 40% of their games. They won one playoff game in that 50-year span, and they never saw a Super Bowl except for the two that they hosted.
that's it's a slap in the face. Hey, you get to host them, so someone else could play. Hey, they get to host a lot of Thanksgiving games. Okay.
I mentioned the Lions play Kingmaker. The Lions did not appear in the playoffs after the 1957 NFL title game until 1970. In that 1970 game, they lost in miserable 5-0 fashion to a different team that had never won anything meaningful in their entire existence up until that moment, the Dallas Cowboys.
Oh, so they turned the Cowboys and the Steelers into winners.
Their next playoff berth for the Lions was 12 years later in the 82 strike shortened season, despite a 4-5 regular season record. So they became, I think, if not the first team ever to make the playoffs with a losing record. It had to be close. And they were embarrassed again. They lost to the Washington Redskin Potatoes 31-7. For those of you keeping score at home, 7 playoff points in 25 years.
And then it led to 3 Super Bowls for Washington, 5 for, I think, Dallas, and I don't remember how many for Pittsburgh, 6 afterwards.
Well, Washington had been a very good team for a long time, so there were a little
But
more
it was the
spaced
Joe
out.
Gibbs era. I'm just saying that they won 3
Yeah.
Super Bowls between 1983 to 9. Oh, maybe they won one before that. I can't remember. But anyways.
Then 83 came. It was another king-making playoff appearance. Detroit had won the Central and almost beat the fledgling San Francisco 49ers, but missed the game-winning field goal as time expired.
And then they crowned Joe Montana, Bill Walsh era, started it up.
These were the prime years of Billy Sims, the Lions running back, to wear number 20 before Barry. He was on a possible Hall of Fame trajectory until he suffered a catastrophic knee injury in 1984, despite never being hit on the play. He crumpled in a heap on the field, and his career was over. Though Sims is in the Lions Ring of Honor and remains beloved in Detroit. So that's why they had their success briefly there, they had about 4 good seasons of Billy Sims. By far the best thing to happen to the Lions since Bobby Layne was Barry Sanders. He is the only Lion to play for the team since the 60s to be elected for the Hall of Fame until 21st century players.
Like a 40-year span or something, 34
Basically.
years. Yeah.
In Barry's third year, 1991, Detroit won the division, hosted Dallas in the playoffs, their first time hosting a playoff game since the 1957 NFL championship, 34 years earlier. And they beat Dallas 38-6 in 91. Of course, Detroit got killed by Washington the next week, 41-10, and they haven't won a playoff game since. And make no mistake, the Lions paid for that 1991 win in the Curse. Offensive lineman Mike Utley was paralyzed from the mid-chest down during a game by Silverdome AstroTurf that was little more than painted concrete.
Mm-hmm.
That was also the year that another Lions offensive lineman, Eric Andelsek, was killed standing in his front yard because a truck driver had fallen asleep at the wheel.
Oh, in his front yard?
Yep. Boom, gone. 2 offensive linemen in 91.
Wow.
Of course, any discussion of Barry Sanders has to include how his time with the team ended. Drafted in 89 and an immediate sensation, the Lions were in or flirting with the playoffs almost every year under then head coach Wayne Fontes, until an injury-plagued 5-11 bottom out led to Fontes' ouster. He was replaced by virtual drill sergeant Bobby Ross, literally drill sergeant. He was a former Army head coach. By 1999, though, the season was the most promising since 91. Most of the major holes on the roster had been filled, and Barry then abruptly retired. Burned out by a Lions team that never gave him the support he needed and a head coach that took all the fun and camaraderie out of football. The vacuum at running backs sent the team to an 8-8 skid, which was good enough to get clobbered in the first round of the playoffs by Washington again. Detroit would not get back to the playoffs until Jim Schwartz in 2011.
Wow, over a decade. I just want to add a caveat to Barry Sanders' retirement. I believe at that point he had it with him and asked for a trade or release. And there were a lot of rumors of him going to Miami to join Dan Marino. And I wanted to see that happen so bad because Marino and Sanders were 2 of my favorite non-Bears players ever. And I think that would have been a fun to see them unite for one hurrah. But because of the curse, Barry Sanders had to quit football altogether just to get out. It's a shame.
I could go on for the next hour on the long list of stupidity and tragedy that the Lions have put their fans through over the last 65 years.
2 words, Matt Patricia. That sums it up.
If ESPN ever did a 30 for 30 on the Curse of Bobby Layne, and they should, it would probably have to be a 2-parter. There's that much to it. Let me hit a couple highlights here. I'm legitimately going to skip probably half of what I prepped here. 1963, Pro Bowler Alex Karras was suspended indefinitely for gambling. He was told to stay away from the Lindell Athletic Club in downtown Detroit due to suspicions of a gambling ring that was thought to be there. What does Alex Karras do? He goes and buys a stake in the Lindell Athletic Club and tends bar there. Well, he's suspended for the year. What else is he going to do? In comes pro wrestler Dick the Bruiser, comes in and challenges Karras to a match. You got to realize Detroit is one of the biggest wrestling territories in the world at that time. Karras accepted. The two ham up a mock fight on the spot here. Okay, yeah, you're in my bar. Now we're going to, and then some really stupid or drunk guy mistook that for actual fisticuffs and broke a pool cue over the Bruiser's head. That's when the real fight started. Everybody gets arrested. Everybody got fined. They did have the match. The Bruiser won, and Karras was reinstated for the 64 season.
Oh, I thought you were going to tell me he got killed in the ring.
No, the next Lion's death wasn't until 64.
Oh, that was the year we're coming up on. Cool.
Yeah, Lions rookie offensive lineman got poisoned and died after his rookie year.
What?
Lucien Rehberg.
Just casually poisoned?
Yeah, it's an old story, and I couldn't pull up a lot out of it, and I honestly didn't want to dwell on it too much.
That sounds like something for #murder podcast, which one of our guests hosts, we're going to have in the future.
Might be. There's the Tom Dempsey field goal, the 63-yarder that stood as the longest in the NFL history for decades. That was 1970 against the Lions. I mean, people hear this today and assume Dempsey was a great kicker. He was not.
He just went against the Lions.
Yeah, he was 5 for 10 on field goals that year, but he kicked 4 of them that day against Detroit for the 1-point win, despite being born with only half of a right foot. Let's see, 1971, Lions wide receiver Chuck Hughes became the only player so far, and hopefully ever, to die on the field during an NFL game. He had been ignoring symptoms of an undiagnosed heart condition for months. He was 28. The game continued for the last 2 minutes or a minute and 10 seconds of a Bears upset win in Detroit, although the crowd was stunned into silence. That we know, thank goodness, that wouldn't happen today.
Yeah. We almost saw it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Let's see here. Oh, and then there's the stupid stuff. 1974, Detroit trades Dave Thompson to the Saints for the Saints' 8th overall first-round draft pick. Sounds great. So what? Trade also included sending Detroit's 13th overall pick to New Orleans, which Detroit didn't realize until they went up to the podium for 13th overall and found out the Saints had the pick.
Wait, they didn't even know that
they did not realize they traded their 13th overall pick to the Saints as part of this deal.
Now that's some good incompetency right there.
Yeah, they thought they were swapping this guy for the 8th overall pick. They actually swapped him to move up 5 spots.
Ouch.
Let's see, there's another death. Don McCafferty, former Super Bowl winning head coach, massive heart attack after his first year with the Lions, 1974.
You blame him? Please don't let Urban Meyer coach for him. Apparently he almost dies on all of his jobs. He will die in Detroit.
1980, Lions start the season hot and at 4-0. And you remember the Super Bowl shuffle, right?
I do.
So, as was trendy at the time, the Lions released their own version of a song. They redid the Queen song, Another One Bites the Dust. And that was pretty much the end of their winning for that year. They finished the year 5-7 the rest of the way. They missed the playoffs. Lions fans were in the stands singing, I swear I'm not making this up, Another One Beats Our Butts. That was also the year that the Lions lost to Chicago on Thanksgiving at home by the Bears returning the overtime kickoff return for a touchdown, which was the only kickoff return touchdown win for overtime in the 20th century.
Wow.
87, then defensive coordinator Wayne Fontes was arrested and arraigned on cocaine possession and 2 drunk driving charges. Most trouble he was ever in until Detroit promoted him to head coach.
That's his punishment.
Also 87, the Red Wings run a series of commercials where fans asked then Red Wings head coach Jacques Demers for Red Wings tickets, and then he proceeds to give them some, but not for the Wings. One of the commercials showed the fans looking at the tickets he got from Demers with a real sour look on his face before saying, the Lions.
That's just mean.
1988, more stupidity. Detroit has the ball on their own 12-yard line. It's 4th down. Right before the ball is snapped for the punt, one of the Saints defensive players yelled Mayday, which was the Lions code word to fake the punt. The code was put in so the team could react if an opponent didn't cover one of the receivers. Jim Arnold, the punter, didn't punt, but instead rifled the ball from his own 1 yard line to rookie Carl Painter, who had no idea it was coming. Ball hit him in the back as he ran down the field.
So the Saints randomly yelled that. Just their code word was just randomly thought out. Just they didn't know
They
it.
probably heard it. I mean, it
Oh,
wouldn't surprise me
or scouting. Okay.
if they scouted it.
Okay, that's.
I'll skip that one because that's more deaths. 1995, height of the Barry Sanders era. Offensive lineman Lomas Brown guarantees a playoff victory in Philadelphia. Detroit lost 56-37. They were down 38-7 at the half.
They put up some fantasy stats to make up for it, I guess, even though no one plays in the playoffs and no one played at the time.
1997, Barry Sanders runs for over 2,000 yards, but shares the NFL MVP award with Brett Favre. The Detroit Lions beat writer Kurt Sylvester voted for Favre and had the nerve to write a column about it.
Or else he wouldn't have shared it.
The day after the award was announced, an otherwise legal vote for Barry arrived in the mail.
So that shouldn't have been split. It should have just been Barry's MVP.
It should have been Barry by 2.
Oh my God, that's a curse. That's rough.
And in the very game in which Barry reached 2,000 yards, star second-year linebacker Reggie Brown was paralyzed making a tackle. Paid for it. 2001, the Lions start the year 0-10, catches the attention of Jay Leno, becoming the butt of jokes. Finally, Detroit beats the Culpepperless Minnesota Vikings to end the losing streak. As the Lions are leaving the field, Johnny Morton turns to a camera in jubilation, Lions wide receiver, Jay Leno can kiss my bleep. That Monday, Jay Leno brought in a live donkey into the studio to kiss while Morton watched via live satellite. The following offseason, Morton was inexplicably cut by Matt Millen.
Well, they did win one game, so Morton must have been great.
Well, with what they replaced him with.
No, Morton was actually pretty good. He was a good third guy, I remember, after Perriman and Moore.
Yeah, he was good enough to be a second guy, legitimately.
He was pretty solid. That was a really good trio back then, I remember.
2002, you'll remember this one. Lions force overtime at Chicago. They win the coin toss. Stiff breeze blows directly toward one end zone. Lions coach Marty Mornhinweg chooses to take the wind and kick off in sudden death overtime.
Oh, that was so funny.
I remember this. I was so mad. You asked me about it at the time, and I was like, I want Marty Mornhinweg fired retroactively to the day he was hired.
Regardless of winning. Like, it was just, as soon as you make that decision, it's like, you don't even get to coach the overtime. We're going to get you out of here, buddy.
I mean, the Bears chose to receive and then scored on the first overtime possession, and that was it.
That light breeze really paid off for the Lions, I guess.
Yeah. 2004, Matt Millen runs into Johnny Morton following a game against Kansas City, which is where Morton was at the time, and Detroit had lost 45-17, as is typical for Matt Millen team. So Morton, they run into each other at the locker room and said some rather nasty things to each other. It's best I don't repeat. And the two needed to be forcibly separated. Millen later apologized. I mean, he's the general manager and team president that's doing this.
What is he, Antonio Brown?
2005, Ford Field security chases a longtime season ticket holder holding a Fire Millen sign around the stadium for nothing more than running away from them with a Fire Millen sign. I mean, of course, the crowd ate this up.
Oh, yeah.
Instant babyface. I mean, security did eventually catch up with the guy who took him down pretty much as hard as they could. And then they banned the man from the building for life and stripped him of his tickets. And this is when Fire Millen became a rallying cry for the Lions.
I was going to say, and he never bought a drink in the town again. Everyone would buy, oh, you're the dude with the Fire Millen sign. Your round's on me, buddy.
Yeah, just about. 2006 is the Pittsburgh Steelers win Super Bowl 40 at the Lions home stadium to shove down Detroit's throat.
Isn't that where the Layne curse started? From Detroit to Pittsburgh?
Yep, Detroit native and Pittsburgh running back Jerome Bettis retires after the win. Remember when I mentioned Jeff Kumlo and the kind of okay quarterbacks of the 20th century? Also 2006, Kumlo's featured on America's Most Wanted. Literally. Enough said.
Wow.
Also 2006, this was busy. Lions assistant coach Joe Cullen drives through a Wendy's to order a late night meal. Why are we talking about this? There were two problems with it. First, Cullen was obviously drunk at the time. Second, he was also completely naked. A week later, the cops caught up with him and busted him for drunk driving.
They have cameras on those things.
Yeah. Please pull forward. Sir.
Oh my God.
2008, Lions go 0-16. Millen finally fired. 2011, NFL finally institutes a rookie wage scale. Too late for the Lions, who drafted Matt Stafford first overall in 2009 and Ndamukong Suh second overall in 2010.
They were spending so much on those two. Oh my God.
After paying Calvin Johnson, the Lions were already capped out and they couldn't retain Nick Fairley or anybody else until they let Suh walk in 2015. Despite strong drafts at the time, Martin Mayhew took the blame as GM and he was fired over the massive contracts that he pretty much had to give.
I remember they were the epitome of studs and scrubs because they hit on their draft classes, but they had to pay them. There wasn't the rookie scale that they were rewarded for 3 to 4, 5 years.
Instead, yeah, at that time, you were punished for a top 5 draft pick because you basically had to give them some of the biggest contracts in NFL history.
Mm-hmm.
In 2016, the Lions lost their 9th straight playoff appearance. That was their most recent to date. Jim Caldwell was fired the next year, which was still a 9-win year, and they only missed the playoffs because of that screwy call against Atlanta that lost them for the tiebreak. I'm not going to even go into all the times that the referees made highly questionable calls against the Lions or anything like that. I'm not going into that. This is just the brutal stuff. And then 2020, at Stafford's request, Matt Stafford is traded to the LA Rams for 2 first-round picks, quarterback Jared Goff, and a 3rd rounder. Won a Super Bowl his first season in LA.
Hey, Lions got to hang a banner saying our former quarterback won a Super Bowl. I've seen that meme all year.
Yeah, we can have that discussion another time. Who's the more annoying Lions fan? The move the goalpost guy who believes Stafford still stinks because he couldn't do it alone, or the we get to hang a Super Bowl banner because our ex-quarterback won with another team guy? Who's more annoying? Send your votes to MidwestFootballPodcast@gmail.com. This is Joe Smith from the Midwest Football Podcast. Please remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It all helps us grow our show. Look for our full show, too, anywhere you find podcasts. Links below.